And now it's 1 o'clock, so time for the next session. I'd like to welcome you all to this first session in the afternoon of Developer. And sorry about that, a slight bit of chaos as my watch decided to fire off a alert and start buzzing right next to my microphone. Sorry about that. If you have any feedback on the event, please don't hesitate to get in touch, whether it be good or bad. We have a code of conduct, so report any issues or anything that happens. Remember that this year, though our costs are different, we still do have sponsors and we're still trying to support various charities, and this year we're looking at trying to support the National Museum of Computing. And even though we're virtual, this event couldn't have gone on without the sponsors, so please reach out to them, thank them, and without them this event wouldn't have been able to happen. So to my session. How can you automatically create Azure DevOps release notes, and how can I publish them? This is a constant question for many people. We need release notes, but where do we get them from? Nobody likes writing these things. Writing user documentation often falls very far down the list of tasks that are going to get done on a project. It's often forgotten. And we need to remember that in many cases, the documentation is only looked at when all else has failed. You know, the normal process is, well, I'll get it out the box, I'll try and run it. If that doesn't work, I'll poke around, I might read some online help if there is any. The last thing people tend to do is ever read the instructions. So it tends to be deprioritized in many projects, but that's a bad thing. You really should be making an effort to try and get this process of getting good release notes and user documentation into your system. Now, what I'm going to talk about today doesn't necessarily help with user manuals and items like that, though it is applicable, and I will come back and talk to that later. But what it can help you with is getting that core list of functionality. What does a specific version of a product do? And through this session, I'm going to show how, using the stuff you have hopefully already used inside Azure DevOps, produce usable release notes for your project. Now, this session is based around Azure DevOps, and so the terminology I'm going to use is Azure DevOps specific, but the broad principles apply to any platform. It doesn't matter if you're using GitHub, GitLab, any of those systems. You do have a repository of tasks, of work that you have done. You've got a repository of commits that you have made, and you are producing some sort of release. So by programmatically tying all of these together, you can produce some sort of release notes. So it is Azure DevOps, yes, but the broad principles should apply for any system. So what has been my journey for my Azure DevOps release notes? Well, the first point to remember is, because I was using TFS back in the day, or Azure DevOps, we have a repository of work items. The work items are the list of work of what we've got to do in developing our software. So if we've structured our work items correctly, or reasonably, provided the developer with enough detail to actually develop the features, the tester with enough detail on how to test it, we have work items that detail what the software should do. So if you've got 20 PBIs, each one details a feature, that's the core of your release notes. If you ship PBI 7, you've shipped the functionality of PBI 7. So whatever the requirement was, or some version of the requirement, needs to go into the release notes. That's the key point that we're starting with. So what happens then is, how do I get those release notes out of Azure DevOps and into a suitable delivery mechanism for people to consume? Well, I started by doing it manually. You can go into Azure DevOps and you can cut and paste bits of the work items and put them in a Word document. You can get a bit cleverer than that. Azure DevOps allows you to connect from Excel, so you could write an Excel query that goes into Azure DevOps and pulls down the work items and builds them as a table. That's not a bad idea. But fundamentally, it was a broadly manual approach. And I realized that that wasn't quite the format I was looking for. I really wanted some sort of text-based format. So my next step was to look at the API that was available at the time, which was the old SOAP C# API. And I wrote a script that would go in and, passing in some parameters, would go and get all of the work items that met my criteria. And then it would spit those out into some sort of list in some sort of text-based format. And that worked fine, seemed a good way to go. But then as time went on, we realized that the SOAP API was slowly being deprecated and being replaced by the REST API. So I went off and I migrated my PowerShell script so that it would run against the REST API. And that went fine. But then you start to think, well, why am I running this by hand? I have an automated build process that builds my software, whether it be nightly, on check-in, when I'm doing a release, whatever. I've got a PowerShell script here. I could wire this PowerShell script into my build process, and that's fine. But then I've got to start to fiddle around with credentials and all sorts of things so I can talk to the API. There must be a better way. And the better way was to wrapper that script inside an Azure DevOps pipeline extension, a PowerShell-based one. So I have a block of PowerShell, and fundamentally the difference between a script that I ran and a script that's running as a task is there's a little bit of boilerplate code at the start that gets the build agent's access token and uses it to talk to the API. After that, nothing really changes. So I wrappered my basic script at that point into a pipeline extension. I also wrote a scripting language at the time so that you could control what your release notes look like, because my release notes format isn't your release notes format. I'm probably not interested in the same things as you are. So it gave some flexibility as to how you designed your release notes. What became very evident when I was writing this task in PowerShell is that I had to employ my own business logic for working out which were related work items to given builds. And so I produced a quite complex set of rules for working out associated work items to builds, and also ones more complex, it turns out, to relate releases to builds and check-ins and work items. So it's all proprietary Richard special business logic that works out what should be going in the release notes in that version. And that task is still out there. That extension is out there. It's my Azure DevOps Release Notes PowerShell. It only runs on Windows. I'm desperately trying to deprecate it because the fact that it runs on business logic that I thought up means it's a little inconsistent with how it behaves compared to the Azure DevOps API. So I recommend people don't look at that one, but quite a lot of people have used it historically and don't particularly want to move away from it. So it's being deprecated very slowly. But a piece of feedback I got to that extension was that it only runs on Windows, and now Azure DevOps is far more cross-platform. Your agents can be cross-platform. That was quite a limit. Now I could go through the hoops of writing a wrapper script to go around my my PowerShell script, so it can be run on a node box using .NET, using PowerShell core. I've got blog posts on how to do that, but it is quite complex, and it wouldn't really address the problem that this was all based on proprietary logic. So what did I do to try and address that? Well, I ported it. I ported it so it ran in Node. So I took the same basic templating engine. I had to make a few minor changes because Node isn't PowerShell, and the way you interpret lines of code, they're not the same, but the changes weren't major. It's had basically the same functionality, but written in Node, so you could run it on any flavor of build engine. That then got picked up because it's an open source project. It's on my Git repo, and there was a great open source contribution from Greg Pakes where he took my code that was all based around calling the REST API direct and switched to using the Azure DevOps Node SDK. That made the that made the code far neater to read and really helped with the general performance and the ease of use for the development. So that was a great contribution, a great advantage to doing this type of work on open source repos where other people can contribute. And I have seen a steady set of contributions to this and my other extensions. We then carried on for a while, adding features slowly, trying to bring up parity between different things. And I got another great contribution, this time from Kenneth Scott, which was to add handlebar support. And this has been transformational in the use of this task. Up until this point, I'd used a scripting engine that I had concocted myself. It worked, but adding extra features into either my PowerShell or my node-based release notes generator was slow and problematic. Swapping to the standard Handlebars templating engine really freed up how easy it was to develop new features, because I lost a vast amount of complexity inside my task for actually doing the generation of the file. With Handlebars, I can throw a template, some objects, push them into Handlebars, and it just deals with it for me. It works really well, and it's really extensible. So that was another excellent open source contribution that I got on the project, really helped to move it forward. So much so that very quickly after we had that extra support in version 2 that supported my legacy system and Handlebars, we switched over to only supporting Handlebars. So dropped my legacy system support, and the volume of code is vastly smaller because of it, because I don't have to handle that. And that's where we sit at the moment. I have 2 release notes generation tasks out there. My old PowerShell based one, which uses my own legacy templating system, which I strongly recommend you avoid because there's so much more functionality in the node-based version. The node-based version can consume far more things in itself, and so generate them out via the template. So I'm sure you're asking, what information can I use? What can I get out there? So what can be looked up? Well, the first thing is it's important for the build to know who it is. So my task supports classic builds, classic release pipeline. So when I say classic, I mean the ones that you configure via the UI, or the newer multi-stage YAML builds or multi-stage YAML pipelines. So the first thing it does is it gets the details of the build that it's running in, or if it's running in a release, the details of all the details of the release and all of the associated builds with that release. It then goes back to try and find the last good build, because we're trying to do release notes since a previous build. It's got to know what the previous build was. Now here I use a variety of mechanisms, and this is still a bit that's a little bit proprietary in the sense of it's the logic for this task, and knowing how this task works can often help explain to you why you've got the results you've got. So fundamentally, if you've got a build, it just looks back by default for the last build on the same branch as you're on that succeeded. So if you've had a build, 2 failed builds, and then a success and another build is running, it will look back 3 builds. So it will try and find the changes since the last successful build. Now you can override that by saying, yes, if I'm using something that's multi-staged, a multi-stage YAML or releases, you can say, don't look at the stage I'm running in, look in a different stage. So you can sort of force the generation to always happen, because you have a stage that's like a dummy stage that only gets run in certain circumstances. So that can be an interesting way of controlling what gets generated, and I'll show you that in a release pipeline demo in a little while. But another recent way that's been added is you can just pass in the version, the build number of a past build, and tell it to always generate against that version. So if you're working on a project that releases not so much in the agile multi DevOps releases a day style, but you're releasing a major product every weeks, months, whatever, you could take the number of the last successful build, the one version 1 that was released back at Easter. You pass that in as a parameter into the task, and it'll always generate the release notes compared to that version until you update that value. So that's a nice option if you've got long running projects and you want to always generate your release notes against a given point in time. But and something I'll come back to is I often find that I want to generate different types of release notes within the same build pipeline. So I want to generate notes that are specific to this build, but also as part of a bigger release plan. So that's a interesting area that we will come back to and look at how you can configure those different things. Then once we've got the builds, we've got 2 build numbers. I can use the standard calls inside the Azure DevOps REST API via the Node SDK that says, get me all the work item references between build this and build that. And it will return me a list of references. It doesn't actually return the work items, it returns references to the work items. So these are very skeletal references. They've got very slim sets of details, nowhere near enough for what I need, but enough to start to build the indexes. I then use similar calls to get all the changes between those 2 builds. Now, the system doesn't care whether you're using Git or whether you're using TFVC. It'll work it all out and just carry on. It'll get you lists of change sets or lists of commits. Next, it goes and gets all of the test runs associated with your build. All ones directly if you're running within a release, as well as trying to get all the test runs that are associated with the builds. It'll also look at tests that have been run specifically within the release, because there's a difference between the 2. So we should end up with a nice big list of tests. Then I start to have to do some work to start to populate fully with all the details that we might want, the data that we've got back. So firstly, I will go through all of the commits, the changes, and make sure that I've got all of the commit messages. The problem here is that by default, the API only returns the first line of a commit message, and you may have many, many lines in there. So you have to do an extra call if work items are marked as truncated. And this gets a little more complex because, as you're all aware, Azure DevOps allows you to call to get its source not just from itself, from Azure DevOps, but also from other source control providers such as GitHub or Bitbucket. The task has to use some extra calls to go and populate this extra information from those other providers if required. So it gets a little more complex than you might think there. Then, because we could have multiple builds as part of a release, or we've had multiple builds because we've checked over a number of failed builds in between, I go through and I remove any duplicates of any of the commits and change sets that I've seen, because we don't want them reported multiple times. I remove any duplicate work item references that I've got, and I then go through and get all of the details for the work item. So this is the point where I actually go off and populate everything with all of the details for the work items that we're going to see. Once I've got all the details for the work items, I can start to look for any parent or child work items of those work items. Because historically, my release notes generator used to just list the work items that were associated directly with the build. And that's fine for a lot of people. But what you often find in a lot of organizations, people associate Azure DevOps tasks with a build, but actually they're not that interested in the task. They're interested in the PBI the task was related to, the parent. So I've added the optional feature of going off and getting all of the parent and child work items related to that task. And there's actually a feature in there that will keep walking up the tree of parents until something doesn't have a parent. So if you've associated a task work item with a build, it can walk up the tree and get the PBI, the feature, and the epic all above it as a hierarchical model. So all of those are potentially available to you in your release notes. Then I go through and try and get all of the associated pull requests. Now, there's a few mechanisms that have to go on here to achieve this. So there's getting the pull requests that are directly associated because it's triggered the build. That's one type of pull request. But you can also go through and look at all of the commits that have been associated with the build, and then look to see if any of those pull requests are related to a PR. And then there's a further level of indirection that, say if you had a dev branch that had multiple feature branches PR'd onto the dev branch, and then you did a PR from the dev branch into the main branch, you would actually have sort of like one step removed PRs that you'd be interested in, what I tend to call indirect PRs. So all the PRs that went into the dev branch. So I go and get those as well. So there's quite a lot of code going on there. And then all of that data is available to you in a template. So how's that presented? Well, it's basically presented as arrays, well-known arrays. So the common objects that are always available, irrespective of what you're doing, are, you've got an array called work items, the work items that are directly associated with the build or release. The related work items is just all of the work items that we have seen anywhere. That's any of the parents, any of the children, anything, they're all in there. So it's basically a massive list of anything we've heard of. We then get a list of all the commits. Now I use the term commits because most people seem to be using Git here, but if you were using TFVC, it would contain all of the change sets as well. The contents of the object do change between a commit and a change set because a commit isn't a change set, but the broad things are basically the same. You do have to tweak the template a little to get data, and I'll go through that. We then have a list of the pull requests. These are the ones that are directly associated with the build. And then, as I just mentioned, the indirectly associated pull requests. So these are ones that are sort of from a pull request within a pull request. So they're just, again, just a big bucket array of them. I then have a list of all of the tests that have been run as part of the build. And then I actually get a little cleverer. I also produce an object called builds. Now the builds object is an array in itself, because if you've got multiple builds because you're inside a release or something like that, what I then do is under the builds object, it has a list of the work items associated with that build in particular, the commits associated with that build in particular, the PRs associated with that build in particular, and the details of the build itself. So if you just wanted to list all of the work items, you'd just list out the contents of the work items array. But if you wanted to list them by build, you know, these are the work items associated with this build and these are the ones with this build, you go for the ones build.work items. So I hope that makes sense. But then we've also got some other objects that are specific to how you're actually using the extension. The build ones, which are what you get if you're inside a classic UI-based build or a YAML-based build, whether it be single or multi-stage, are the build details, i.e. the build you're on at the moment, the compare build details, which are the build we compared against, and the current stage. So if you're in multi-stage YAML, it's the name of the stage you're on. If you're in single stage, i.e. you don't have a stage, you haven't bothered to define one, it's underscore default is the name of your stage. So there'll always be a stage there, but that's more a multi-stage YAML thing. And if you're running inside a classic UI-based release, you get release details, compare release details, and the tests that are specific to the release. So we've got all these objects. We need to format them. Now you can see there, to get those objects, there've been a lot of calls to the REST API to build all of that information all up. But now we need to actually produce the stuff to get actually a file to come out. And we do that now with a Handlebars template. So a Handlebars template looks like this. Now, you can produce any text format you fancy with Handlebars. 95% of all of my samples, and I think nearly all of the support issues I've dealt with, people are trying to produce markdown files. But because it's a text-based format, there's nothing to stop you producing an HTML file, if that makes sense. You would just change the basic bits of the template that aren't handlebars to generate that format. I've also dealt with somebody who wanted to produce everything as XML. So you can generate an XML file with the information, and then they transformed it further with an XSLT style sheet. So all of those options exist. So how does it basically work? Well, at its simplest, you put in something for the language you're using. So in my case, Markdown. So # build just makes it a level 2 heading. And then I use the double curly brackets. I give it the name of the object and then the property on that object that I'm interested in. So list the build number, which is sort of the build name. What branch was it on? When did it finish? And what was the previous build that I worked on? Nice and simple, because that's just a simple object, the build details. For things like the pull requests are an array. So I can put in a line that says list out, tell me, you see we've got the heading 2 title again, associated pull requests, and we use the length of the array just to give us a count of how many we've got. But then we use the standard handlebars construct of a for each to loop across that array. You can see the start and the end in blue. And then we can start to just use some indenting. I get out the pull request ID, its number, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I put that inside a markdown hyperlink. So the square brackets, then the curly brackets, all gets a bit bracket mad, this. And then I can then use the this operation. So that's the loop round the pass through the loop. So I get the URL of this pull request. And here we hit a problem that the URL that's provided back via the API is set up for talking to it via the API. So it's got the underscore APIS block in. So I use a replace function, and I'll talk more about extensions in a moment, to take that URL and just rip out the bit that says APIS git repos and just replace it with underscore git, which converts the URL from the REST version to a version that if I click on it, will open it up in the UI. Now I could do something far more complex and tidy that behind the scenes, but I've taken the view of, I basically try and pass back what I got from REST, and I'll let Handlebars do any of the weird formatting, because otherwise I'd be going on forever to try and work all of these out. So there we've built a hyperlink, and then at the end we just drop the title at the end to sort of say what the title of the PR was. And you can, and then we close that for each loop, and we can nest our for each loops. So if I wanted to get the work items that were associated with the pull request, I'm in the pull request, so it's a this is that for each this in green is a pull request. I then ask for the associated work items with it, and then that just gets me back a URL to the work item inside the REST API, which isn't what I want. So what I have to do is use another little helper function, which is called I do a lookup. And I tell it to look up in the array of all of the work items I've ever heard of in the system. And I have to go up 2 levels to get out of the loops. And then I pass in the URL. So my little helper function takes that URL and enables me to go and have a look inside that array, find the right item and return it. And that's what the with command does. And once inside the with command, I can then do this dot. So inside the with command, this has become a given work item. So again, I can build a hyperlink that's got the work item ID, same little trick to sort out the URL and give it a title. And that's the broad process of the template. You can do the stuff at the top in green with the build is nice and easy, just dump it out. And most people, most of the time, that's all they really need to get their release notes to come out. The loop is a critical point in that allows you to loop across all of your work items, your arrays, whatever, and you can loop across any of them. And then with some helper functions to tidy things up. So at its simplest, you probably just list out the pull request IDs and the titles, but then you can start to make things more interactive by adding hyperlinks and the like. So I talked about extensibility, and this is the really good thing about Handlebars. It's so extensible. So by default, I include in the way I've implemented Handlebars, the Handlebar helpers library. And this adds over 120 extra extensions into the Handlebars syntactic language. And these do lots of useful things like all your string operations, your trims, your replaces, your substrings. There's maths operations for max, min, add, subtract, all of those sorts of things, and numerous others. things to help with formatting and the like. So that's a really useful way of working. And they're all in there. You just look on there and it keeps it up to date. That really does help. But I've also written some of my own extensions. So we've already seen a couple of them. We've seen the lookup work item. So the lookup work item takes an array of work items and a URL and does the heavy lifting of from that URL working out which work item you were talking about and returning that work item. We have exactly the same for lookup a pull request, because though my previous example worked the other way around, in that I looped across the pull requests and then found an associated work item, you could have your template working the other way around. You could loop through all of your work items, then look up associated pull requests. I skipped over the first one, which is arguably the most useful extension I've written, which takes an object and just dumps its raw JSON. So when you're starting to write a template, say you're working with the current build object, you can just go JSON current build object and your release notes will just contain the JSON for the object. And that's really good. So if you're new to this, you can do that, dump out the values and then just have a look in the release notes and go, oh, the field I want is called build number. I don't want build ID. Build ID is the internal number. I need the public number, which is build number. It's great for exploring. Now, the extension does have other ways of dumping. You can dump to the Azure DevOps log. I added that feature and I found it's not very helpful because it tends to be the dumping tends to be very verbose. And there's also a means of dumping all of the JSON for all of the objects to a file, a .json file, which you could make as a published build artifact or the like. They're useful ways of working, but 9 times out of 10, I find I just use the JSON dumper. And the final one is, I told you have to do some extra work to make sure that you get all of the commit messages. As soon as I added that feature, I got people coming back to me saying, my release notes used to return 1-line commit messages and now they return multi-line. It's broken. So I had to write an extension to unwind the feature I just added. So you want to just get the first one. But I said Handlebars is extensible. I provide a whole pile of samples for extra extensions that are quite useful, but you can write your own. So if you wanted to write your own extension, you just write it like this. You know, that is the basic bit of code. And if you wanted multiple extensions, you just put them all inside the module exports brackets. So this is the logic of the get first line of message, takes in the message and it just splits on the carriage return and returns the first thing. You can do anything you want. You can write your own iterators. If you want to replace the for each with your own system, there's samples for doing all of that. And then if you wanted to make use of your extension, you just call it inside the squiggly brackets along those lines. Now you can pass in your own set of extensions as parameters into my build release notes task. So that means if you need to do something special, you can pass it all in. So that's really nice to actually work with. So running the task, it's just the task. So if you drop it into your release pipeline, fundamentally, all you have to really give it is a template file, or you can declare the template in line and an output location. There's a whole pile of other flags, which I'm not going to go into, but they basically switch on and off functionality. But the default should be there or thereabouts for most people. But it's all well and good here that you've got your release notes being generated and they're sitting on some folder on your build box. What are you going to do with them now? They're not much use to anybody on a build box. So what are your options? Well, there's a few. One is you can attach them as artifacts on the build in the same way that when your build finishes, it publishes an MSI, an AppX, a jar file or whatever you're building. You can just add the MD file, the markdown file, as another artifact on that build. And I find that a very useful way of working. That works great. You could save them to some known location, a UNC share, something like that. Don't think this is a particularly bright idea. In fact, our build boxes at Black Marble can't actually see any UNC shares or anything because they're just standing as standalone machines, not domain joined. All they can see is Azure DevOps. So the only option they really have is to push things back as build artifacts. You could try and email them to somebody. There are tasks for Azure DevOps and the other release pipeline systems to try and send emails. I have found this as becoming increasingly difficult to make work. The problem really is that the spam filtering that most systems have really doesn't seem to like automated build boxes sending emails very much. And I often find that my attachments just don't make it through because of spam filtering and the like. So it's not a solution I tend to favour these days. But the final one is, and arguably the most useful is, why don't you put this information straight into a wiki where it can be used? And to that end, I ended up writing more tasks. So I have another task which will take a file and push it up to a wiki. And that wiki could be Azure DevOps or GitHub are the ones that I've tested and support. I'm sure it will talk to any others as long as they're Git based. What this task does is it goes off, it clones the repo, it takes your specified source file, which is the output of your release notes generator, and publishes it to the repo and hence to the wiki. So whereas this is nice, because as long if you manage to generate your release notes with a new name every time, you can have each set of release notes just dropped into, in this case, into a folder. So a product, the file name will be product X, and every time we do a new build, we'd have a new Semver version and it would push up the file as a new file name. So there's a history of all of those release notes. So that's a really nice way of working, I find, and often deals with that, where's my standard documentation? Well, you can have a wiki, a living document that's got documentation in it, but you then extend it with release notes that gives the changes between each of the releases. But I don't like my release notes being in Markdown because that means somebody could edit them and break them and do whatever. And that's something we need to consider. That's not right for everybody. It's awkward to try and generate release notes into a format that's immutable. So the best solution I found was a rather interesting little tool by Max Melcher, which allows you to, it's a command line tool that you can point at a Git based wiki and it will export it all as a PDF. Really nice tool to use irrespective of what you're doing. So if you need to take a wiki and ship it to somebody as a PDF, this is the tool for you. Works really well. So I had a chat with Max and I wrote a wrapper for it. So you can actually wire it into your release notes process. So what you could do is generate your release notes, publish them up onto a wiki, and then export the wiki as a PDF and attach that as a build artifact, if that's what you wanted. I also tweaked the tool because his command line tool, though designed to export a whole wiki and then put it into a single file, you will also work with single files. So you can also use this task just to generate your release notes first, then use this task to convert the Markdown file straight into a PDF and then attach the PDF as an attachment. So you've got all sorts of options around there that really do try and help in this area. It's really a case of what works for you. And so with that, let's actually have a little look at some of this. So if I pull that up, so all of my extensions are sitting in my GitHub repo. So if you want to have a play with any of them, they're all in there. So you can actually see all the code for them. They're also up in the marketplace. So that is the PowerShell based version. And that is the node-based version. The usage is showing that this is catching up quite quickly, which is good. And then if I wanted to include my release notes, here's a task. And you can see here, I include my release notes. This is actually part of my release pipeline for actually releasing the release notes task. And I pass in an inline template And we can see there's a template that broadly follows what we were talking about. It gets the pull requests, it loops through all the builds, looping out the items that are included under the builds, then it lists the global work items. It basically loops through most things. And then it uses the Wiki updater to push that up to a server. So if I hop over here onto where the Wiki is, we can see the release notes that have been generated for these various tests, and I've got ones that run on different systems. It's an interesting one. Testing this type of task is always interesting. I have to write quite a lot of code to make sure I'm constantly adding tasks, work items, branches, change sets that automatically get triggered and run into the pipelines. But you can see here how we've got links off to other things, and I can see various different stuff. I've got various different formatting issues as I'm playing around here, but you get the basic idea. Now, you might be thinking, well, I've got to add this to my release pipeline, and that's all a bit hard. And faffing around with this template all seems a bit of a thing that, oh, this could take forever to do. And I felt exactly the same. So one thing that I decided to add was a command line tester. So when I'm working on templates or working on extensions, I don't want to keep having to trigger an automated build to make sure they work. So what I did, and you can find this, I'll just show you where you can find it first. If you go into the repo and you go in and look for the extensions and you find the cross-platform release notes, version 3, test console. This is what I'm running, the test console as documented here. So I've got all this loaded up in Visual Studio Code. Instead of passing in all of the parameters that you would normally pass in because you're inside an Azure DevOps release pipeline, I've got a big file that just specifies them all. So this is my build settings.json. So these are all the parameters that are available to you. So I've basically hard coded in a build, and I want to run the release notes as if I'm running from inside that build. Now I do need to pass in a pat token for this to work, because normally that would automatically be picked up by the build agent and dealt with. And we can also see that I'm telling it that my template file is this one. So we can see here I've got a template file, which allows me to test any functionality that I want. The other nice thing that I can do is if I'm doing anything with custom extensions, I could in there put all of the custom extension, or I can just point to a file that's got a bit of a custom extension. So here's an extension. I can't even remember what I was trying to test there, but we get the idea. So to run this, all I do is drop into the folder, build it. I pass in the name of the extension, pass in a pat token. I let it run. The logging for this task is quite extensive, so if you have any problems, switch on detailed logging and it will tell you all the steps it's going through, what it's finding and various points, and it often explains why you're not seeing what you expect you're seeing. This should take about 20-30 seconds to run. So as you see, it's enriching all of the work items. For enriching a work item, what that broadly means is it's going off and getting a hold of the commit messages. It's now dealing with all of the work items. It's looking for parents. There we are, and it's finished. So what it's done is it's outputted the generated template, so we can see it in there. So if I went and tweaked this template and reran it, this would look different. But it's also outputted a JSON file, and that is all of the objects that we have seen. So I could format that a little neater, and we would see that. So I can see that we have work items or an array, and I've got an ID and a rev and a fields and a whatever. And this would tell me how I can work down through all of these objects and get out all of the information that I want. And I can see that I'm running quite close on time. So how do I use these tools in reality? You know, there's a lot of tools here that you can use them very flexibly, and your mileage will be different. You will do something different to what I do in all of these tools. The first one is within a CI build, Normally only onto the main branch. I normally wouldn't bother to generate release notes on every test build inside a working branch. I'll generate the release notes. So that is the release notes. What has changed in this build, normally associated with a PR into the main branch. So these tend to be granular. They tend to only have one feature in because you're branching for a PBI. When the PBI is done, you're PRing back into main. So that's all there is. They tend to be short, so you can always give a bit of context. They're there. I'm not certain how useful their documents are, but they're always there. You've always got them for consistency. Where it's more useful is generating the release notes that will go to the customer. So these are the release notes that you may only release when you go to a certain stage. So if you've got a release pipeline that builds the product, but only when you're on main does it push it out to UAT or live or whatever, that's where you would put the release notes. You put the release notes generation into the deployment stage or associated with the deployment stage. So it's only run when you've gone to that stage. So you may do 20 PRs into main before you go to live. So when you generate the release notes then in live or UAT or wherever you're going to, it'll be the release notes for all of those 20 changes. So you get a nice big chunky set. So it's, remember, the release notes are generated from the last successful release to that stage. Now, and again, you can override that if you want. You could put in a hard-coded build number, so it always generates release notes compared back to that. Or a technique I've also seen is people create a dummy stage in their release pipeline or their build called documentation and tell the release notes to always generate since the last time there was a run to that stage. So again, you can tweak that. You only run that stage when you want to iterate and sort of reset the flag for generating your documentation again. So those are the two ways we've been using it. And again, the first one we tend to attach as a build artifact. The second one we push into the wiki. And the first one is sort of focused there for the testers to give a bit of context to people, a bit of a progress report. The second one's more focused on the people who are going to consume whatever it is, whether it be users or if you're producing a library, the people who are going to produce the library, use the library. So, summary. You should have, if you're using a mature ALM solution, most of the information you need for your release notes already in work items. So make use of it. Now, it might mean that you choose to modify your work items to add a custom field, which is the text that you want to appear in the release notes. That's fine. You can do that. But fundamentally, the bulk of that information is already there. So make use of it. You want to use tools that will make the production of the release notes easy, not onerous. It's been a theme on this track today, and quite a few sessions I've seen, that you want to make things easier for people to consume. They shouldn't have to worry about doing it. It should just happen. And this is just an extension to that. Don't make it, oh God, we're shipping on Monday and no one's written the release notes. Panic, panic, panic. Throw something together. If they're generated every time, they're always there. They're always available. So make use of that. And so automation, as in all things in DevOps, is your friend. You don't want to be cutting and pasting manually like I started doing. So these slides are already up on my GitHub presentations repo, so you can find all of those. So don't worry about the links, but there's all of my extensions are there. There's blog posts, there's usage, there's stuff on all of that. And with that, we'll look to see if we've got any questions. Lee, do we have any questions?
We've got one that came in. When getting the last successful build, can you filter it based on the branch?
By default, I believe that is the functionality that is already there. If you've got a different use case where you want it to compare to a different branch, I don't think my task did that, but fundamentally the Azure DevOps build, that's what it wants to look for. It's always comparing against the branch you're on. So it will ignore all the other branches. So I think the answer to that one is yes, but if you want to play around with it and find it doesn't do what you want, just use the new feature in GitHub of discussions, and we can open up a discussion around this, or log an issue and I'll have a look at it. And with that, it's if you do have any questions, reach out to me via Twitter, my blog, or if it is related to this, by far the best place is GitHub issues or GitHub discussions in this repo. Do we have any other questions?
None coming through. Got some thank yous coming through for you, Bill.
Okay. Well, if that's the case, we'll shut down the stream and let everybody nip off and get a coffee before the next one. And thanks for attending this session, and hope you enjoyed the remainder of DDD.